Well, hello Dragons, and welcome to this instructional video for Lesson 12, Part 3, Cooperation and Trade Barriers. The main idea behind this economics lesson is nations engaging in trade make decisions on the level of activity that will be allowed with their partners. With that in mind, by the end of watching this video, you will be able to explain why nations impose trade barriers, summarize the key arguments made in favor of free trade, and describe the types of agreements that indicate nations following the policies of cooperation. Now that the outcomes for this lesson have been shared with you, let's get started. International trade allows people and nations to specialize in the production of goods and services. Economically, international trade is a positive force promoting efficiency and growth. Because of a variety of factors, however, nations often restrict the free exchange of goods across national borders. Government actions that are designed to protect domestic industries and jobs from foreign competition are called trade barriers. The major types of trade barriers are tariffs, import quotas and voluntary restrictions, and embargoes. Any tax on imports is a tariff. Tariffs are either revenue tariffs, which raise money for government, or protective tariffs, which restrict the number of foreign goods sold in a country. Until the early 1900s, revenue tariffs, or customs duties, were a major source of income for the U.S. government. After the U.S. government adopted the income tax in 1913, revenue from tariffs was considered less important to government finances. A protective tariff is designed to favor domestic industries over foreign competitors. By increasing the prices of imported goods, protective tariffs tend to reduce the quantity of foreign goods demanded. Suppose that a Japanese firm sells a motorcycle for $5,000, and that a comparable U.S.-made motorcycle costs $7,000. The $2,000 price difference would cause many buyers in the United States to purchase the Japanese model. If the U.S. government places a 50% protective tariff on Japanese motorcycles, the imported motorcycle's price will jump substantially to $7,500. The protective tariff increases the price of the Japanese motorcycle, thus making it more expensive than the American motorcycle. This price difference would encourage many consumers in the United States to buy the American model. The United States has used protective tariffs for much of its history. The McKinley Tariff Act of 1890 set such high tariffs that many foreign competitors were totally excluded from American markets. The Smoot-Hawley Tariff of 1930, which was enacted at the onset of the Great Depression, decreased imports by almost 60% and had a negative impact on all international trade. Since World War II, the United States has reduced its use of protective tariffs. Governments can also use import quotas and voluntary trade restrictions to decrease imports. Both of these forms of regulation are intended to help domestic businesses sell their products by limiting the quantity of a specific product that can be imported into a country. An import quota, which sets a fixed amount of an item that can be imported, is a law. A voluntary trade restriction is a binding agreement between two nations that does not require congressional action or legislation. Import quotas and voluntary trade restrictions occasionally are directed at specific goods from specific nations. In 2021, for example, the United States government responded to domestic steel producers for industry protection from European competition. A law that cuts off imports from and exports to specific countries is called an embargo. Historically, embargoes have been enacted for political rather than economic reasons. The Embargo Act of 1807, for example, was a politically motivated embargo designed to stop France and Great Britain from raiding ships belonging to U.S. merchants. More recent embargoes have also been used for political purposes. In 1985, for example, President Ronald Reagan placed a partial embargo on the sale of certain military and computer goods and technology to the Republic of South Africa. This action was intended to pressure the South African government into ending apartheid, an oppressive political, economic, and social system based on racism. Trade restrictions were lifted in 1991 as South Africa moved to end apartheid. Other trade barriers include licensing requirements and extensive paperwork, which can interrupt the free flow of goods between countries. Some nations require firms to obtain a special license before they can import goods. By restricting the number of licenses, these nations ensure that fewer foreign goods are imported. In some nations, paperwork delays also interfere with trade. In Japan, for example, imports are subject to extensive testing and inspection, and time-consuming and expensive paperwork must be completed. Many exporters choose not to sell their products in Japan for this reason. In 1959, Fidel Castro established a communist government in Cuba, expropriating U.S.-owned property. The United States opposed Castro and banned direct trade between the countries. With the passage of the Helms-Burton Act in June 1996, however, companies, even those from nations other than the United States, may encounter barriers to trade with the United States. Specifically, the Helms-Burton Act provides various punishments for any companies or their employees who are caught using properties in Cuba that were expropriated from U.S. firms and organizations. Free trade is international trade that is not subject to government regulation. Supporters of free trade believe that exports and imports should flow freely between nations. Not everyone supports free trade, however. Some people believe in protectionism, the use of protective tariffs between nations to favor domestic industries. The arguments used by both protectionists and supporters of free trade are based on infant industries, job protection, standard of living, specialization, national security, and fairness. First, protectionists argue that a nation's infant industry should be protected from foreign competition until they are able to establish themselves. By restricting imports by the competitors of these new industries, the government allows the infants to build up a strong domestic market. Today, many developing nations use this strategy to help kickstart their economies. Those on the side of free trade believe that the decreased competition resulting from trade barriers encourages poor resource use because the protected businesses have less incentive to be efficient. Free trade supporters also claim that these temporary protective measures are likely to be extended indefinitely because of the political pressures that businesses exert on government. Once protected, always protected, they argue. A second argument in favor of protectionism is based on the claim that reducing foreign competition allows more businesses to compete in the domestic market and provides more jobs for domestic workers. Free trade supporters, on the other hand, claim that trade restrictions actually reduce the employment of U.S. workers. They note that trade barriers put up by the United States historically have caused other nations to respond by erecting barriers to U.S. trade. These barriers hurt U.S. businesses in the world market and ultimately reduce the number of American jobs. Protectionists point out that trade barriers help maintain the high wages and standard of living available in the United States. The trade barriers between nations are needed, they say, because other nations' cheap labor gives them an unfair advantage in world markets. People who support free trade believe that the high wages and high standard of living in the United States can be maintained without trade barriers. They claim that U.S. businesses can afford to pay high wages and still produce competitively priced products because of U.S. workers' skills and efficiency levels. People who favor protectionism argue that free trade encourages businesses to over-specialize. They further claim that over-specialization can cause a nation's economy to be hurt by changes in world demand. These protectionists urge nations to encourage businesses to produce a wide variety of products while protecting businesses that lack an absolute or comparative advantage. Those who support free trade believe that it benefits the world economy and that competition guarantees the best product at the best price. They recognize that an economy based on a single product is not as strong as a highly diversified economy like that of the United States. Both protectionists and free trade supporters agree that some industries must be protected from foreign competition and failure because they are vital to a nation's national security. In the United States, protected industries include steel and other heavy industries, advanced technology businesses, and energy-based industries. This kind of protectionism makes the United States less dependent on foreign firms during times of national emergency. While acknowledging that vital industries must be protected, people who support free trade claim that non-essential industries abuse this argument with false claims. On the issue of fairness, protectionists argue that few, if any, nations allow truly free trade. Protectionists feel that U.S. barriers should match those of other nations. Free trade supporters agree that some nations violate the notion of fair trade, but they prefer to dismantle trade barriers. Rarely is a government's trade policy completely protectionist or completely based on free trade. Instead, most nations' policies reflect a variety of international and domestic factors that can stem from economic or political factors, or both. The government may protect some industries while allowing free trade in others. In the United States, government officials closely watch the nation's trade situation so they can react to policy changes in other nations. To reap the economic and political benefits of global trade, many nations have engaged in international cooperation. Some examples of trade cooperation among nations are reciprocal trade agreements, regional trade organizations, and international trade agreements. With the election of President Franklin Roosevelt in 1932, the United States began an ambitious plan to restore slumping international trade. The Reciprocal Trade Agreements Act of 1934 identified protective tariffs as the leading obstacles to trade and sought to reduce them in two ways. First, it gave the president power to reduce tariffs by as much as 50%, provided that other nations made similar compromises regarding trade regulations. Second, it allowed Congress to grant Most Favored Nation, or MFN status, to U.S. trading partners. Any partner awarded this status pays the same preferred tariffs as those paid by all such partners. Thus, if the United States lowers the wheat tariff from 20% to 10% for one MFN, the tariff reduction automatically applies to all other MFNs. Congress has the final authority to grant and to revoke MFN status. Before the Korean War in the early 1950s, for example, the former Soviet Union enjoyed Most Favored Nation status. This privilege was revoked during the Korean War, however, as tensions increased between the two nations. Conversely, it has also arisen with U.S. trading partners such as China. Many nations have formed regional trade organizations or alliances to reduce or eliminate trade barriers among member nations. Such benefits, however, usually are limited to the member nations and may have negative consequences on nations that are not part of the alliance. Examples of existing regional trade organizations include the European Union, or the EU, which includes Austria, Belgium, Denmark, Finland, France, Germany, Greece, Ireland, Italy, Luxembourg, the Netherlands, Portugal, Spain, Sweden, and the United Kingdom and Ireland, and the Caribbean Community and Common Market, or CARICOM, which includes Antigua and Barbuda, the Bahamas, Barbados, Belize, Grenada, Guyana, Jamaica, and other smaller nations. Other organizations are the Central American Common Market, which includes Costa Rica, El Salvador, Guatemala, Honduras, and Nicaragua. The Association of Southeast Asian Nations, or ASEAN, including Brunei, Indonesia, Malaysia, the Philippines, Singapore, Thailand, and Vietnam, and the Southern Common Market, Mercosur, which includes Argentina, Brazil, Paraguay, and Uruguay. The most significant international trade agreement of the post-World War II period was the General Agreement on Tariffs and Trade, or GATT, and Multinational Trade Agreement. 23 non-communist nations signed this agreement in 1947. GATT members met periodically in conferences known as rounds to discuss issues in international trade. Two of the best-known rounds of GATT talks were the Kennedy Round, which concluded in 1967, and the Tokyo Round, which was completed in 1979. Each round of talks resulted in substantial tariff reductions and opened additional talks on related issues. In the 1980s, growing concern about non-tariff barriers such as quotas, voluntary restrictions, and licensing requirements also were included in GATT negotiations. The GATT talks in Geneva, Switzerland, and the Uruguay Round reaffirmed nations' support for free trade despite increasing pressures from protectionists. In 1995, GATT was superseded by the World Trade Organization, or WTO. Membership in the WTO now includes 164 nations that have pledged work to reduce tariffs and eliminate quotas. Another significant development in the expansion of international trade was the negotiation of the North American Free Trade Agreement, or NAFTA. Signed by the United States, Mexico, and Canada in 1992, this agreement was designed to reduce and eventually eliminate tariffs on all goods and services coming into and out of these countries. NAFTA was modified in 2020 with the approval of the United States-Mexico-Canada Agreement, or USMCA. It expanded the provisions of NAFTA by strengthening its economic protections, as well as adding coverage to the automotive and dairy industries and exchange rates. In recent years, more global companies have built plants in the countries with which they do business. The decision to build in a foreign nation can benefit both the multinational corporation, the MNC, and the host nation. The corporation is able to avoid some shipping fees, protective tariffs, and quotas. The host nation benefits from additional employment opportunities and higher revenues from taxes on the corporation's incomes, profits, and properties. During the 1980s and 1990s, a number of foreign firms located plants in the United States. Nissan, for example, began building cars and trucks in Tennessee, and Honda began making motorcycles and cars in Ohio. Some companies choose to organize joint ventures. Under joint ownership arrangements, two companies from different nations can agree to build and operate a production plant. The profits are shared by both companies, usually according to a written agreement. Joint ventures include the General Motors and Toyota joint venture to produce cars in California, Boeing Corporation's teaming with the Japanese Aircraft Corporation to develop more advanced aircraft, and the agreement between RCA and Japan's Sharp Corporation to build satellites together in the United States. These recent changes in international trade have created new trade issues, such as whether goods produced by joint ventures in the United States should be considered American-made. Another concern is that MNCs and joint ventures will outproduce and thereby hurt domestic producers in nations in which they build plants. To address this, nations throughout the world have instituted performance standards for multinationals that build plants in their countries. These standards require the corporation to export a certain percentage of its output. The hope is that such requirements will protect domestic industries. So that's the way it is with Lesson 12, Part 3, Cooperation and Trade Barriers. At this point, you should know that Nations impose trade barriers to protect domestic industries and jobs from foreign competition. Free trade supporters promote the decreased competition to strengthen infant industries, protect domestic jobs, maintain the standard of living, increase specialization and fairness, and reciprocal trade agreements, regional trade organizations, and international trade agreements are policies nations use to engage in cooperation. Don't forget to subscribe to my channel to have the entire catalog of economics videos available at your fingertips. Click the subscribe button and then click the follow bell to receive notifications as to when the channel is updated. Thanks for watching, and I'll catch you in class, Dragons. See ya!